In 1985, the Soviet Union appeared intact. On paper, it was a superpower stretching across 11 time zones. Its military arsenal rivaled that of the United States. The Warsaw Pact remained under Soviet control. From Havana to Hanoi, Marxist governments still echoed Kremlin slogans. But beneath this surface, the structure was brittle. The system that Stalin had industrialized, Khrushchev had destabilized, and Brezhnev had stagnated, was showing signs of exhaustion. It was a giant, but a tired one. That same year, Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary of the Communist Party. At just 54, he was the youngest leader in decades and represented a new generation, articulate, pragmatic, and aware of the system's deep flaws. Unlike his predecessors, who died in quick succession, Brezhnev, Andropov, then Chernenko, Gorbachev did not see stability as enough. He believed reform was not optional. It was a question of survival. The Soviet economy was in crisis. Oil prices, the lifeblood of Soviet exports, had plummeted. Central planning had led to inefficiencies no one could solve. Tractors sat idle for lack of parts. Grain rotted during transport. Military spending consumed upwards of 20% of GDP, while consumer goods were scarce. Supermarket shelves remained symbolic, bare, unsatisfying, and ignored by state propaganda. Internationally, détente had evaporated. Reagan's rhetoric of the evil empire and the announcement of the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, unnerved the Soviet leadership. They feared an arms race they couldn't afford. Afghanistan had become a quagmire, draining money, morale, and men. At home, nationalities in the Baltic states, Caucasus, and Central Asia were simmering with quiet resistance, long masked by fear. Gorbachev initiated two key programs: perestroika, restructuring, and glasnost, openness. Perestroika aimed to modernize the economy by introducing limited market mechanisms. Glasnost allowed controlled freedom of speech, meant to expose bureaucratic corruption, but it did more than that. It reopened historical wounds. People began questioning not just the inefficiency of the present, but the crimes of the past. In 1985, the changes were subtle. Gorbachev's speeches were still optimistic. Western leaders, including Margaret Thatcher, expressed cautious hope. Soviet citizens were told reform was compatible with socialism. But inside the Communist Party, anxiety grew. Old guard conservatives feared a slippery slope. Reformers, on the other hand, were frustrated by the limits imposed on change. Few outside observers predicted collapse. Even fewer inside the USSR did. The Union had survived purges, famines, wars, and external threats. Yet by 1985, the seeds of unraveling were planted, not by enemies, but from within. The system's legitimacy was eroding not because of sabotage, but because people began to stop believing in it. In April 1986, a disaster struck that would symbolize everything broken within the Soviet system: the Chernobyl nuclear accident. A routine safety test spiraled into a reactor explosion, spewing radioactive material across Eastern Europe. But more damaging than the radiation was the secrecy. Local residents were not informed. First responders lacked proper gear. Moscow delayed global acknowledgement. When news finally surfaced, it was not through Soviet channels, but via Swedish monitoring stations. Chernobyl became more than an environmental catastrophe. It shattered public trust. The USSR's most guarded industry, nuclear energy, was now exposed as incompetent and unsafe. Glasnost, which had been cautiously promoted before, accelerated. Suddenly, Soviet citizens were reading about long-hidden events: the Katyn massacre, Stalin's purges, even failures in World War II. For the first time, state narratives were questioned openly. This newfound openness extended into popular culture. Newspapers began publishing letters criticizing bureaucrats. Theater productions explored taboos. Authors once banned were reprinted. Glasnost was meant to reform socialism, not dismantle it, but the effect was destabilizing. Once truth seeped through, it couldn't be contained. At the same time, perestroika began to stall. Economic reforms faced resistance from entrenched interests. Regional managers ignored central reforms. Factory directors clung to quotas, unsure how to function in a semi-market economy. Prices were distorted, productivity declined, and shortages worsened. Bread lines lengthened, and inflation crept into daily life, a new phenomenon in a state-controlled system. In 1987, Gorbachev introduced the concept of demokratizatsiya, a partial opening of the political system. For the first time, multi-candidate elections were allowed within the Communist Party. It was framed as a revitalization of Leninist principles. But practically, it signaled the erosion of the party's monopoly. Reform-minded officials began gaining public support. Conservatives resisted. Power, long centralized, was beginning to fragment. In the republics, Ukraine, Lithuania, Georgia, Armenia, local movements took root. Some demanded environmental reform, others language rights. But behind these causes lay something deeper, a reawakening of national identity. These republics had histories that long predated Soviet rule. Glasnost gave them voice, Chernobyl gave them cause. Internationally, the West watched with mixed views. American and European leaders welcomed reforms, hoping for a Soviet softening. Reagan and Gorbachev held summits in Geneva and Reykjavik, reducing nuclear stockpiles and warming diplomatic ties. But internally, not all Soviets approved. Conservatives saw Gorbachev as reckless. Some called for his ouster. By the end of 1987, the contradictions were impossible to ignore. The USSR claimed reform, yet clung to control. It permitted speech, yet censored dissent. It allowed elections, yet feared their results. The pillars of Soviet ideology, unity, control, strength, were no longer firm. The cracks had widened. What had begun as repair was starting to look like dismantling. By 1988, the Soviet Union was no longer a monolith. The vast empire, once ruled from a single iron desk in Moscow, began to rumble from its outer edges. What had been whispered in kitchens now echoed in public squares. Nationalism, long suppressed, surged across the republics. In Armenia, protests erupted over the Nagorno-Karabakh region, a disputed territory claimed by both Armenia and Azerbaijan. What began as a local dispute quickly took on broader significance. For the first time, ethnic grievances were broadcast openly across Soviet television. Crowds demanded reunification, not just with land, but with history and identity. Gorbachev's promise of openness had unintentionally lit a fire he could no longer control. In the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, independence movements emerged with precision and purpose. Citizens formed human chains stretching across borders. They sang banned national anthems, flew outlawed flags, and reclaimed forgotten languages. These weren't riots, they were disciplined, symbolic acts of defiance. In 1988, Lithuania formed Sąjūdis, a movement openly calling for independence. By 1989, the other Baltic states followed suit. Meanwhile, in Georgia, demonstrations in Tbilisi ended in bloodshed as Soviet troops cracked down on peaceful protesters. The incident backfired. Far from silencing dissent, it fueled rage. The old tactics, military force, censorship, arrests, were no longer effective in the age of glasnost. Every crackdown now created martyrs, not submission. At the heart of the empire, Moscow was unraveling politically. The 1989 Congress of People's Deputies was televised, a groundbreaking move. Viewers watched as delegates grilled party leaders, criticized the KGB, and challenged the very structure of the Union. Boris Yeltsin, once purged from the Politburo, re-emerged as a populist figure, demanding faster, deeper reforms. His defiance electrified the public. Beyond Soviet borders, changes in Eastern Europe mirrored and magnified the Soviet crisis. Poland held semi-free elections, and the Communist Party was defeated. Hungary opened its borders with Austria, breaching the Iron Curtain. East Germans began fleeing westward through neighboring countries. The symbolic heart of the Cold War, the Berlin Wall, was cracking, both literally and politically. Gorbachev made a fateful decision: he would not intervene militarily. The Brezhnev Doctrine, which once justified Soviet invasions of Hungary and Czechoslovakia, was quietly buried. The world saw this restraint as moral courage, Soviet hardliners saw it as surrender. Either way, the result was the same: Eastern Europe was slipping away. Inside the USSR, public opinion shifted. State television, once a tool of propaganda, now served as a platform for debate and protest. Documentaries revealed Stalin's crimes. Talk shows featured dissidents. Satirical plays mocked the bureaucracy. The very fabric of Soviet legitimacy, myth, silence, obedience, was fraying under the weight of truth. By the end of 1989, the Soviet Union was no longer an empire in control. It was a federation of restless republics, a state battling its past, and a leadership caught between reform and collapse. The people were no longer afraid, and the system had no answer for that. By 1990, the Soviet Union stood on the edge of fragmentation. What had begun as reform was now an open revolt against the very foundation of the state. Republic after republic declared sovereignty, not quite independence, but a bold first step. Russia, the core of the Union, did the same. Under Boris Yeltsin, the Russian parliament proclaimed that its laws held primacy over Soviet ones. In effect, the Russian Federation was separating from the Soviet Union while still inside it. The Communist Party was rapidly losing its grip. In March 1990, Gorbachev was elected the first, and ultimately the last, president of the Soviet Union. But it was a title without traction. Real power was shifting elsewhere. The Soviet economy, already battered by poor planning and military overspending, began to collapse. Shortages of bread, fuel, and basic goods sparked unrest in cities that had once been tightly controlled. By 1991, republics like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania had declared full independence. Others, like Ukraine and Georgia, were preparing to follow. The Kremlin's authority was melting, replaced by local parliaments, new constitutions, and rising national flags. Gorbachev, caught between liberal reformers and hardline communists, appeared increasingly isolated, respected abroad, but weakened at home. Then came the coup. In August 1991, hardliners in the KGB, military, and Communist Party launched a dramatic attempt to seize control. Tanks rolled into Moscow. Gorbachev was detained in his Crimean dacha. State media announced a new order. But this was not 1968. This was not Prague. The world had changed, and so had the people. Boris Yeltsin stood atop a tank outside the Russian White House and denounced the coup. Millions watched live broadcasts of citizens confronting soldiers, barricading streets, waving the Russian tricolor. The army, uncertain and divided, refused to fire on its own people. After just 3 days, the coup collapsed in humiliation. Gorbachev returned to Moscow, but the moment was gone. The failed coup shattered what little remained of Soviet unity. In its aftermath, Yeltsin banned the Communist Party in Russia. Republics accelerated their breakaways. Ukraine held a referendum, over 90% voted for independence. Kazakhstan, Belarus, Armenia, and others quickly followed. On December 8, 1991, leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus met in secret at a dacha in the Belovez forest. They signed an agreement dissolving the Soviet Union and creating the Commonwealth of Independent States. Gorbachev was not even consulted. On December 25, 1991, Gorbachev addressed the nation. He resigned as president. Behind him, the red Soviet flag was lowered over the Kremlin for the last time, replaced by the Russian tricolor. A nation born in revolution had ended with a televised farewell. The Soviet Union did not fall in a single battle, nor did it collapse from a foreign invasion. It unraveled from within, undone by its contradictions, its rigidity, and its failure to adapt to a changing world. The Soviet Union, once the world's largest state and America's chief rival, ceased to exist overnight. But its fall left behind more than just a power vacuum. It left a world changed, reeling, and uncertain. 15 independent republics emerged from the USSR's remains. Russia inherited most of the Soviet military, nuclear arsenal, and international obligations, yet even it faced economic collapse and social turmoil. Factories closed. Inflation soared. Crime syndicates flourished. The 1990s would be known as Russia's lost decade, a time when a superpower became a fractured state searching for a new identity. In the newly independent republics, the transition was uneven. Ukraine, rich in agriculture and industry, saw early hopes fade as corruption and political instability set in. The Caucasus region plunged into wars, Georgia's civil conflict, Armenia and Azerbaijan's bitter struggle over Nagorno-Karabakh. In Central Asia, strongmen rose to power, holding on to Soviet-era authoritarianism under new flags. Internationally, the collapse shocked even Western leaders. The Cold War had defined global politics for nearly half a century. With its abrupt end, NATO was left without its main rival, while the US suddenly stood as the world's sole superpower. This unipolar moment ushered in a new era of American foreign policy, marked by interventions in the Balkans, the Middle East, and beyond. Yet the fall of the USSR did not bring the peace many had hoped for. Instead, it birthed a fragile global order and a Russia that never fully accepted its diminished role. Throughout the 2000s, under Vladimir Putin, Russia began reclaiming influence, politically, economically, and militarily. Former Soviet states found themselves caught between East and West, between nostalgia for stability and aspirations for democracy. The legacy of the Soviet collapse remains visible today. In Russia, many still mourn the loss, not of communism, but of superpower status. In Eastern Europe, memories of Soviet occupation fuel skepticism toward Moscow. In the West, the victory in the Cold War bred a dangerous overconfidence, a belief that liberal democracy would spread naturally. But history doesn't follow scripts. The dissolution of the USSR teaches us that empires, no matter how vast or powerful, are not eternal. They can be brought down not just by war, but by stagnation, by disconnection from the people, and by leaders unwilling, or unable, to change course. For some, the Soviet collapse was liberation. For others, it was a catastrophe. For all, it was a turning point. A civilization built on revolution, centralized power, and ideological certainty had collapsed into dust. What followed was not just a geopolitical shift, it was a psychological one. For millions who had lived their lives under the red banner, the world had changed overnight, and the future was unknown. But perhaps the most lasting lesson is this: the mightiest regimes can fall not with a bang, but with a silence, when their people no longer believe, when their structures hollow out, and when even power cannot hold together what the spirit has already let go.